Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going on a journey through the history of opium.
Okay.
We'll be using Wikipedia as our guide.
Sounds good.
And we're going to be exploring how this substance went from, the joy plant and even God's own medicine to a global concern.
Right.
I have to admit my knowledge of opium is pretty limited.
That's okay.
But luckily, we have an expert here to help us unpack this complex story.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
So let's start with the basics.
Sure.
What exactly is opium?
Well, opium is the dried latex obtained from the seed capsules of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum.
Yeah.
You know those images of poppy seed pods with the milky sap oozing out?
Yeah.
That's opium.
Okay, so it's not the seeds themselves, but this sap.
Correct.
Okay.
This latex contains a mixture of alkaloids,
Right.
including morphine and codeine,
Okay.
or powerful painkillers.
Wow.
In fact, morphine is chemically processed from opium to create other synthetic opioids like heroin.
Ah, so that's the connection. I always knew opium and heroin were related somehow.
Yeah, they are.
Interesting.
Opium's pain-killing properties have been recognized for thousands of years.
Wow.
We're talking way back to the Neolithic Age,
Ah.
over 5,000 BCE.
Wow.
Back then, it wasn't just a medicine. Evidence suggests they used the entire poppy plant,
Wow.
even the seed capsules, as food.
Wow, a food source. I had no idea.
Yeah.
So it's been a part of human history for a really long time.
It has.
Wow.
The Sumerians, who lived in Mesopotamia around 3400 BCE,
Okay.
were among the first to cultivate opium poppies.
Interesting.
They called it the joy plant,
Joy plant.
which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
Even then, they recognized its ability to alter mood and create pleasurable sensations.
It's interesting how that name, joy plant, hints at both the medicinal and recreational aspects of opium.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that duality has been a recurring theme throughout opium's history. The ancient Greeks, for example, used it as an anesthetic, a sleep aid, and for digestive issues.
Uh-huh.
Dioscorides, a famous Greek physician
Okay.
from the 1st century CE, detailed opium's medical applications in his book De Materia Medica.
That name rings a bell.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't there a quote from him about opium being able to both help and harm?
You're right.
Okay.
He called it a pain easer, sleep causer, and digester, but cautioned against excessive consumption.
Wow.
Even in ancient times, they were aware of the potential risks.
That's amazing.
It's a bit like fire, it
Yeah.
can warm you or burn you,
Right.
depending on how you use it.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So while the ancient Greeks recognized its medical benefits, they also understood that opium could be dangerous if misused.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this understanding of opium's dual nature,
Right.
its capacity for both healing and harm,
Yeah.
continued to evolve throughout history.
Okay.
We see it in the writings of Avicenna, a renowned Persian physician who lived in the 11th century.
Okay.
He described opium as the most potent stupefacient
Uh-huh.
in his book, The Canon of Medicine.
Stupefacient? What exactly does that mean?
It refers to a substance that induces stupor or dulls the senses.
Oh.
Avicenna was acknowledging opium's powerful effects on the mind,
Right.
its ability to alter consciousness.
Interesting.
This was centuries before the concept of addiction was fully understood.
Right.
But physicians were already observing these profound effects.
It's fascinating how they were grappling with these complex ideas about a substance we're still trying to understand today.
It is.
So how did opium spread from these ancient civilizations to the rest of the world?
Well, trade played a significant role.
Okay.
Around 1300 BCE, the Egyptians established a vast opium trade network
Wow.
across the Mediterranean.
Uh-huh.
This helped spread knowledge of opium and its uses to different cultures.
It's amazing to think about how this one plant and its potent sap traveled across continents and influenced the course of history.
It really is.
Yeah.
And as opium spread, so did its reputation as both a valuable medicine and a source of potential danger.
Right.
This brings us to an important turning point in the story, the reintroduction of opium to Western medicine.
I think I read something about returning crusaders playing a role in that.
Yes, it's likely that returning crusaders brought opium back to Europe in the 11th century,
Okay.
reintroducing it after a period of relative obscurity.
Uh-huh.
But the formal reintroduction of laudanum,
Okay.
a specific opium-based preparation,
Right.
is credited to Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist
Okay.
in the 16th century.
Uh-huh.
He believed laudanum held powerful healing properties.
Oh.
and even claimed to have created stones of immortality containing opium.
Stones of immortality. That sounds pretty mystical.
He was a controversial figure known for challenging traditional medical practices,
Okay.
and his work with laudanum,
Right.
while groundbreaking, also
Yeah.
contributed to opium's growing association with both medicine and mystique.
So, after Paracelsus, what happened? Did laudanum become a mainstream treatment in Western medicine?
It did.
Okay.
Laudanum became incredibly popular in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Wow.
Thomas Sydenham, considered the father of English medicine, was a huge proponent of laudanum. He
Huh.
called it a cure-all,
Wow.
even referring to it as a gift from God.
God's own medicine. That's a pretty powerful endorsement.
It was.
Wow.
At that time, laudanum was used for everything from pain and insomnia to coughs and diarrhea,
Okay.
compared to other treatments available then,
Right.
which often involved toxic substances like arsenic. Opium was considered relatively safe and effective.
I could see how that would make it appealing, especially in an era with limited medical knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But I imagine this widespread use also had its downsides.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
While opium was hailed as a miracle cure,
Uh-huh.
its euphoric effects led to increased recreational use, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Right.
And that's where things start to get really complicated.
So the shift from medicine to recreation, that sounds like a pivotal moment in opium's story.
It is. You know, it's fascinating how the perception and use of opium varied across different cultures. Like, in Europe, laudanum became readily available and was widely used as a social drug.
Really?
Imagine elegant salons where people sipped laudanum as casually as we might have a glass of wine today.
Wow, that's hard to picture. But I guess it speaks to how attitudes toward drugs can change so drastically over time.
Absolutely. In the Ottoman Empire, opium consumption was also widespread, with some users claiming it brought them closer to spiritual enlightenment. You know, it's a reminder that the way we interpret the effects of drugs is often shaped by our cultural beliefs and practices.
So the same substance could be seen as a social lubricant in one culture and a path to spiritual insight in another. That's incredibly interesting.
It is. And then there's China, where early accounts linked opium to enhanced masculinity and sexual experiences. You can see how these different interpretations combined with easy access to laudanum contributed to a rise in recreational use.
And I imagine this is where the darker side of opium starts to become more prominent.
Sadly, yes, as recreational use increased, so did the problem of addiction. Opium dens began to emerge, and they quickly became associated with vice and social decline. These dens paint a starkly different picture from those elegant European salons we talked about.
It's a reminder that even something initially seen as harmless or even beneficial can have a dark underbelly. You mentioned a book called Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Did that play a role in shaping public perception of opium addiction?
Absolutely. Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1822 by Thomas de Quincey, was a groundbreaking work. De Quincey's vivid and often haunting descriptions of his own struggles with opium addiction brought attention to the devastating consequences of its misuse. His work served as a wake-up call, contrasting sharply with the prevailing image of opium as a benevolent cure-all.
It's fascinating how literature can sometimes expose societal problems and force people to confront uncomfortable truths. But the story of opium goes beyond individual addiction. There's also the infamous opium trade, which had a profound impact on global events.
Yes. The opium trade was a dark chapter in history, driven by greed and exploitation. The British East India Company played a central role in this trade, holding a monopoly on opium production in India and actively encouraging its consumption in China. Think about that. A powerful corporation deliberately fueling addiction in another country for its own economic gain.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of some of the ethical debates we're having today about corporations and their global impact.
It's a relevant comparison. The British East India Company flooded the Chinese market with opium, leading to widespread addiction and devastating social and economic consequences. It was a blatant example of economic exploitation with lasting repercussions.
It sounds like the Chinese government tried to resist this, right?
They did. Alarmed by the growing crisis, the Chinese government tried to ban the opium trade. Their efforts, however, were met with fierce opposition from the British, who were determined to protect their lucrative opium profits. This clash of interests ultimately led to the Opium Wars.
The Opium Wars, that's a term I've heard before, but I have to admit I don't know much about them.
Well, in 1839, Chinese authorities seized a massive shipment of opium from British traders.
Wow.
This act of defiance sparked the First Opium War. The British, with their superior military might, decisively defeated the Chinese, forcing them to sign a series of unequal treaties. These treaties opened up Chinese ports to British trade and essentially legitimized the opium trade.
So the British went to war to protect their right to sell opium, a drug they knew was causing widespread harm.
That's the stark reality of it. The Opium Wars are a glaring example of how economic interests can be used to justify aggression and exploitation on an international scale. And the impact on China was devastating, leading to further social unrest, economic decline, and a weakening of the Chinese government.
It's incredible to think how one substance could be at the heart of such a complex web of historical events. But amidst all this darkness, weren't there efforts to control opium use and production?
Yes. Even as the opium trade flourished, concerns about addiction were growing, and efforts to control opium began to emerge as early as 1729. China implemented policies aimed at prohibiting opium. These early attempts, though ultimately unsuccessful in stemming the tide of addiction, laid the groundwork for later international efforts to regulate narcotics.
So even during a time when powerful forces were actively promoting opium, there was a recognition of its dangers and a desire to curb its use.
Precisely. And those concerns continued to gain momentum. The International Opium Commission, established in 1909, marked an important step toward multinational cooperation in addressing the challenges posed by opium production.
Right.
This was followed by the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the United States in 1914, which, while technically a tax, effectively served as a prohibition on opiates.
It sounds like the world was finally starting to recognize the need for a coordinated response to the problem of opium.
It was a slow and often difficult process, but awareness was growing, and that awareness led to the involvement of the League of Nations and later the United Nations in regulating narcotics. These organizations played a critical role in shaping international drug policies with the aim of controlling the production and distribution of opium and its derivatives.
So the story of opium takes us from ancient medicinal use to international conflict and then to the beginnings of global drug policy. It's quite a journey.
It is, and this journey also leads us to another fascinating chapter, the role of opium in the development of modern pharmaceuticals. It might surprise you to learn that opium has played a pivotal role in some of the most important medical breakthroughs in history.
Oh, that's interesting. I tend to associate opium with its negative aspects, but you're right. There must be more to the story.
There is. The isolation of morphine from opium in the early 19th century marked a watershed moment in medical history. It was the first time a pharmaceutical was isolated from a natural product, paving the way for the development of other opioid medications. Morphine, despite its addictive potential, revolutionized pain relief and is still used in medicine today, though, under strict regulations.
So the same substance that caused so much suffering also led to breakthroughs in pain management. That's quite a paradox.
It is. It's a reminder that scientific discovery is often a double-edged sword. And the story of opium highlights the importance of ethical considerations in how we harness scientific knowledge. But the story doesn't end there. Remember heroin. It also emerged from opium.
Heroin. I always knew they were connected, but I'm not sure I understand how.
Well, heroin is a semi-synthetic opioid derived from morphine. Ironically, it was initially marketed as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. In fact, it was even used in cough syrups for children.
It's hard to believe, considering what we know now about its highly addictive nature.
It's a stark reminder that even with the best intentions, scientific advancements can have unintended and devastating consequences. The development of heroin, despite its initial promise, ultimately contributed to the opioid crisis we face today.
It's a sobering thought. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the ancient uses of opium to its role in global conflict and the development of modern pharmaceuticals. It's a truly fascinating and complex story.
It is, and despite all our efforts to control and regulate it, opium in its various forms continues to impact our world in profound ways.
So before we delve into the modern opioid crisis and what opium's legacy means for us today, let's take a quick break. We'll be back soon with more on the deep dive.
So we've been talking about this complex history of opium from, the ancient uses as a medicine and all the way to, international trade and development of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
But let's kind of shift our focus to the present.
Okay.
How is opium used today?
Well, in the industrialized world, raw opium isn't really used medicinally anymore.
It's been mostly replaced by purified derivatives like morphine and codeine.
Right.
Which are, tightly regulated and prescribed mainly for pain management.
So while we might not see opium prescribed directly, its legacy kind of lives on in these medications.
Right.
So what about in other parts of the world?
Yeah.
Is opium still produced and used in its unrefined form?
Yes. Opium production continues, but it's largely illicit now for a long time.
Okay.
Afghanistan was the world's leading producer, but there's been a surprising shift recently.
Oh, what happened?
In 2023, Burma overtook Afghanistan as the world's largest opium producer.
Oh, wow.
When the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan in 2021,
Right.
they reinstated a ban on opium production. This,
Yeah.
combined with ongoing instability and conflict,
Right.
significantly reduced Afghan opium cultivation.
So politics and conflict have a huge impact on this, global drug trade.
They absolutely do. The story of opium is kind of this, tapestry woven from ancient history, scientific discovery, political machinations, and ongoing social struggles.
It's a story that's still being written, isn't it, as we grapple with, the modern opioid crisis?
Yeah.
What lessons can we learn from opium's, long and complicated history?
Well, I think the most important lesson is the need for a balanced and thoughtful approach.
Okay.
We can't deny the legitimate medical uses of opioids,
Right.
but we also can't ignore the very real dangers of addiction and overdose.
It sounds like finding that balance is a huge challenge.
It is. We need a, multifaceted strategy.
Yeah.
Responsible prescribing practices, increased access to treatment and recovery services, and a strong commitment to curbing the illicit drug trade.
Right.
It requires cooperation from healthcare providers, policymakers, and society as a whole.
It's a reminder that the choices we make, both individually and collectively, have, a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Just like the ancient Sumerians recognized that dual nature of the joy plant, we need to be mindful of both the benefits and the risks of these powerful substances.
Exactly. Opium's story underscores the enduring power of nature and the importance of responsible stewardship of its gifts.
Right.
By learning from the mistakes of the past and, harnessing our scientific knowledge, we can strive for a future where these substances are used ethically and for the benefit of humanity.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of opium.
You're welcome.
It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey, and we encourage you to, keep exploring the many facets of this complex story and to consider the lessons that it holds for us all